So the purpose of today's talk is to give you the annual update with a slightly different flavour, to try and give you an indication of some of the trends that we're seeing, pretty much in response to what Colin has already said, the transitional commissioning guidance that came out just over 2 years ago now. And there's some interesting patterns of behaviour that have been adopted in response to that, people quite understandably changing how they run their practices, how they see their patients, because they have a fear that if they don't, they could end up losing their practices and their patients. So I'll just start off with the general background, just to sort of refresh the memory of, because obviously the BSA was set up in 2006 to monitor contracts, just covers England and Wales. It has no jurisdiction over Scotland and Northern Ireland, of course, and that was the statutory instrument that supported its establishment. The DPB was abolished on the day before, and it has a responsibility to monitor the performance of contractors and to prevent, detect and investigate fraud or other unlawful activities. Fortunately, we see very little of that in orthodontics. I'm going to give you an update on how we monitor contracts. I'm not going to talk about clinical monitoring today. Clinical monitoring is my main job, and I'm pleased to report that we continually find high standards of care being provided. But I'm not going to speak about that today because time is pressing, and this is more to do with the commissioning side of things. Quality, obviously, is pivotal. It's almost a given in orthodontics, I would say, with a few exceptions. So we'll start off with the data collection. Much of this will be familiar to you. I'll talk about the vital signs reports again, the dental assurance framework reports. I won't go into too much detail about that, although I think Alice has some words to say perhaps about work that's been done in London there. And then we'll talk about the transitional commissioning guidance indicators. I remember we discussed those 2 years ago and then last year, and then there's some interesting figures to look at in that regard today. And then we'll just finish off with some 2014-15 activity, which again will illustrate the sorts of trends which I suspect you know are happening out there, and it sort of confirms your suspicions. So if we look at the vital signs data, this is a bit dry, this one, but it gives us a good starting point. The percentage of assessments that are assess and fit appliances is nearly half now, which has been an increase, and you'll see that in a minute. The assess and refuse is actually interesting. They've increased slightly, and that's at 13.1%. It's always bumbled along about 10%. The percentage of assess and reviews, that's dropped significantly over the years, 37.7% as the year to June. All of these figures are 12-month rolling, which is a reduction. It used to be up in the 55% figures. The percentage of courses which are abandoned or discontinued, 7.8%. Now that's interesting because that's a decrease too, which surprises me somewhat, and I can't actually reconcile that with my experience. And in fact, I believe that the true figure is actually higher than that, and we'll discuss that later. I've mentioned this before at previous conferences. Sorry. The next figures, percentage of completed treatments where the pass score was undertaken. I mean, that's at 58.6%, but that's way above the statutory requirement, which is, as you probably know, 20 cases plus 10%. I just think that many practitioners are routinely getting their pass scores done now. I mean, you can argue the toss as to the value of it, but if you're going to do it, it's certainly more valuable to do huge figures, or all of them, rather than a small sample. The rate of removable appliances per 100 appliances, I'm not going to dwell too much on that because I don't believe that's particularly informative. The percentage of courses where proposed treatment with removables only is 2.3%, and actually fewer at the end. And that's really what we would expect. I mean, bear in mind that these figures do include 4 UOA cases as well as the 21 UOA cases, but we do still see 21 UOA cases where just the removable appliance is fitted. And one can argue the toss there, but certainly I don't believe usually that represents value for money. And then the percentage of patients who have expressed dissatisfaction, 96.6%. It just illustrates that the vast majority of orthodontic patients are satisfied with the treatment that they receive. There's no surprise there, and that's a consistent figure. The only caveat I place is that this is these questionnaires that support this evidence go out early in treatment, and therefore it's not completed treatment. There's a lot more work that could be done with patient satisfaction, and Colin has touched on this. We spent a lot of time at the strategy meetings talking about patient-reported experience measures, the PREMs, and the patient-recorded outcome measures are slightly different than the PROMs. And BOS is working, and I think Eastman and Sheffield are doing a lot of work in that regard, and certainly Nikki Atack and I had a lengthy discussion about this issue right at the outset of the strategic framework planning document. If we look at the trends, this illustrates quite nicely what I've just said. If you look at the patient satisfaction rates, they've always been, this is the blue line at the top here, they've always been up in the high to mid-90s. If we look at the next one down, this burgundy line, this is the percentage of assessments that were assess and review, and it's quite interesting. If you look, it was 55% back in 2008-9, and it's gradually reduced over the years, and then dropped off the cliff. And that coincides with the publication of the Transitional Commissioning Guidance. If you look at the purple line, which is assess and fit appliances, it's mirrored, really. So what were previously, this is a percentage of assessments, of course, but there's a matched increase in the number of case starts, which is exactly what the intention of the Transitional Commissioning Guidance was. But of course, it's the law of unintended consequences. There are drawbacks, so it's not all good news in terms of, if you like, value for money. The percentage of completed treatment pass scores, you can see that, again, there's been, I don't know why there's been this huge increase. It'd be interesting to hear the audience's views on that, because there's no statutory requirement to do it. It's good practice, I'm sure. Is there local pressure being brought to bear? It'd be interesting to hear what people have to say. The assess and refuse is this red line, and as I say, it's always bumbled along just above 10%. It has been, I mean, it doesn't really show with this scale, but there has been an increase over the last year or two. I'm not sure why that would be. Again, your thoughts would be welcome. The next one is the percentage of cases, the yellow one, is the abandoned and discontinued cases. And again, it doesn't show particularly well in this slide, but if you look really closely, you'll see that it used to be around about 10%, which is what we always predicted and expected. Sorry. No, sorry. Sorry if you couldn't hear me. The percentage that were abandoned, discontinued, we always, when we went into this contract, we were expecting about 10% based on the previous behaviour in the fee per item contract, and it has dropped. It has dropped. That might be better. It has dropped in the last year or two. Again, why? I don't know. If we look, there is a regional difference. Now, these figures are 2013-14. I put them up. I know it's a year out, but I've got this year's as well. And this will please Alice. If you look, to explain this graph, the blue are the assess and accept FP17s. The burgundy are the assess and review, and the green the assess and refuses. And this is as a proportion of FP17Os. So the blank ones at the top are usually the treatment completed reporting. So an FP17O goes in with a completion. So that's why it doesn't number 100%, if you're wondering. But that in itself will show you something in a minute. The London, back in 2013-14, it was around 27%. Really lagging behind lots of other areas of the country, the north of England and Midlands, 31, 32%, the south just below 30, and England slightly below Wales. And I always apportion that to the fact that Wales have been very proactive in trying to maximise the number of treatments it got for its expenditure. If we look, it's a slightly different font size, but you'll see, if you look at the figures for the financial year that ended in March, you'll see that London has done very well, and this is largely due to the work that's been done within London to try to maximise the number of courses of treatment that are claimed versus the number of reviews, or put it another way, to reduce the number of assess and reviews. Still quite a few assess and refuse in London. I guess that's a feature of the competitiveness of the London market, the number of practices. GDPs will refer patients with borderline need or no need because they're feeling pressurized to do so. And obviously, these patients need to be seen, and there needs to be an outcome. And unless you do like Colin's doing, you don't submit an outcome, then there will be assess and refuses. But well done, London, if well done is the correct term to use, but certainly interesting patterns of behaviour. South of England lagging behind a bit, and England and Wales. England actually, if I'm not mistaken, doing slightly better, if better is the correct term, than Wales. If we look at the vital signs form, you'll see this is relevant because Colin has approached me on a number of occasions about his frustration that practices with waiting lists are being penalised because they quite rightly claim an assess and review when they first see a patient, and then subsequently when that patient starts, maybe 12, 18, 24 months later, they quite rightly claim an assess and accept or assess and fit appliance. And he feels quite rightly that the contractors and performers that should be targeted are those that are just repeatedly reviewing the same patients, as we all do as clinicians, but claiming a UOA on each occasion. And this is where this figure is relevant. This is the one figure within the vital signs that is over a 24-month period as opposed to a 12-month rolling. And that's the 24-month ratio of assessments to patient IDs, and it gives contract level and national level. And this slide illustrates the fact that the it's on the y-axis, is the number of contracts, not performers, contracts. It's difficult to look at this at performer level. And then this is the ratio of assessments the patient identifies. Now, to put this into context, if you only saw or claimed for treatments, it would be 1. If you claim any reviews, it will be 1 or more than 1. So the vast majority are 1 to 1.1, which I think is commendable, and it illustrates that people are working within the spirit of the 2006 contract, if not the letter, because the letter says you can claim as many reviews as you see fit. And then, but these really, I would say, for our commissioning friends, are the contracts where they need to be identified, and the discussions need to be had as to why this is happening. Why are they? Now, if it's because they're working a waiting list, then so be it. That needs to be discussed. But if it's because they're multiple reviewing, then equally a different discussion needs to take place. The dental assurance framework reports, I'm not going to dwell too much on this. It's just I felt I needed to include it because commissioners get these. My understanding is contract holders don't as yet, although that is the plan. But the purpose is to support a more standardised approach to contract management. It's not intended to supplant other commissioning guidance or the role of routine contracting processes. And there's various indicators: delivery, assessment, treatment and outcomes. And it's a tier 1 or overarching analysis. In other words, this isn't meant to be the final say on the matter. It's for, an opportunity for further investigation and discussion. The reports are available quarterly to area teams. They contain flags, or contracts with flags for attention. There is a size element to avoid discrimination against smaller contracts. The plan is for practitioners or contract holders to be able to see their own via the portal. I think there is a delay there. Hopefully it won't be too long. And obviously the commissioners use it as they see fit. Now, the delivery is the percentage of contracted UOA, that's year to date, that's from vital signs. The next 3 are all from vital signs. This is not in vital signs, that's the percentage of assessments and review for patients 9 years old or under. Colin's already made reference to the fact that many of our colleagues are declining the opportunity to see patients at that age. That isn't in patients' interests, in my view, so that needs to be looked at. And not in practitioners' interests either, for that matter, particularly given as Colin has also made reference to, the reduction in orthodontic training as part of the undergraduate curriculum. The ratio of reported concluded to assess and fit, self-explanatory. It should be 1 to 1, but isn't. Percentage of concluded reported as removable appliances only. That should, of course, be very low. The ratio of UOAs per reported completed case, now that on the face of it sounds like a really good measure. Colin's request to you for suggested KPIs. It's a really good measure if you can do it at patient level, because and then you can report what the average is per patient. But unfortunately, the way this data is produced, it looks at the contract size or value and the number of reported completions, and then divides the two and comes up with a figure. The problem is if you've got a growing contract, let me get this right. If you've got a growing contract, the ratio is lower, and if you've got a reducing contract, the ratio is higher. So it's not as you need to drill down to see whether it's valuable or not, and I'm not convinced it's as valuable as we were hoping. The percentage of contracts meeting their expected pass scores we've already touched on, and the percentage of concluded cases where treatment is reported as abandoned or discontinued, again from the vital signs. These, of course, are concluded cases, and then there is a summary for the area teams where they have priority contracts where these various elements are flagged or not, as the case may be, and then that's what the individual contract profile may look like. Again, the area team commissioners can look at that and identify issues either within their whole patch or within that particular contract. If we now move on to the bits that perhaps of a little bit more interest and relevance to today, the traditional commissioning guidance indicators and the impact that's had, I'll just remind you of what they were, in case anyone's forgotten. I suspect most of this audience haven't. But there's 5 indicators, each contributing 20% to the total score of 100%. The NHS Dental Services is only able to provide information on indicator 1, that's the UOA value, 2, the case assessments versus case starts, and 4, the completion of cases started. We collect data on which cases have been pass scored, but not the actual pass scores themselves. And the patient experience, the referral to treatment with 18 weeks, that information isn't held centrally. And then each was given a percentage, as you know, 20% for excellent or best practice, 15 for good, 10 for acceptable, and 0 for unacceptable. And this, at that stage, was the recommended action. I'm sure that Alice will have words to say on how realistic that is and how much it's being implemented, but basically 90% plus you get your contract extended by 3 years, 70 to 85% 2 years with a 90% target, 50 to 65% you'd only get a 1 year contract with an indication that you had to improve to at least 70%, and then less than 50% you get 6-month extension and you need to improve to 70%. That was the plan. If we look at the case assessments, the case starts figures, so this is last year's figure. So this slide was shown at last year's conference, and it was used to illustrate the fact that most contracts were struggling to reach the 20%. That's the 1 to 1.4 ratio of assessments to case starts. Now bear in mind, there is some confusion, but the vital signs data, the BSA data, an assessment is all of the assessments, so it includes the assess and fit appliance, as well as the reviews and refuses. So, in other words, to have a 1-to-1 ratio, you'd do absolutely no reviews or refuses at all. So, quite a tall order for referral-only practices, which are popular, having lots of referrals, to get to this 1 to 1.4 ratio. In other words, to get its 20% in this category. There's about 20% of contracts were achieving the 15%, which is good, or in the vernacular. And then you can see the majority, 44%, were in the 2 to 3.9% range, and the small minority, about a quarter, were claiming more assessments per start than 4 to 1. If we look at this year, this is quite interesting because it shows the pattern of behaviour. The 20%, it's gone up. It's 21.6% of orthodontic contracts, and a quarter of all contracts are now achieving this quite difficult 1 to 1.4 to 1 ratio. So one has to conclude that quite a few people are behaving like Colin and not claiming for all their assessments. Is that correct? Is that right? The 15%, again, about a quarter. So, and then if we look at the 2 to 3.9, virtually the rest are in that category. Hardly any are now exceeding the 4 to 1 ratio. If we just illustrate that in a slide, just to put a picture to it, that was 2013-14. This is last year, the last financial year, that finished in March. And you can see the excellent is now a quarter, the good is a quarter. So put the two together, over a half are achieving the 20 or 15% scores, if you like. A massive improvement or change. I'm loath to use the term improvement because it's a change in pattern of behaviour. It's improvement if you want more treatments and fewer reviews, for sure. If we look at an alternative indicator, now you may remember BOS approached me and my colleagues at the BSA if we could come up with what they would perceive would be a fairer indicator too. And we did, and we came up with one where we thought if you scored practitioners 1 to 1.9 to 1, then that would discriminate less against those who are operating their contracts completely appropriately, referral-only practices, seeing patients for reviews or assessments, and then subsequently deciding on whether or not they needed treatment, giving opinions, that sort of thing. And with the 1 to 1.9 to 1, 38.9% and 41.7% of contracts would have got the 20% category, and 32.3% would have got it based on 2 to 2.9. So the suggestion was, this wasn't from the BSA, this is the BOS, that this was a fairer measure. If we look at that for last year, you can see, so this is for the last financial year, the one just finished, half of orthodontic contracts are achieving that, and another third are achieving the 15%. And again, if we illustrate that in a graph, you can see that's the 20% crowd, and that's the 20% crowd, and that's the 15% contractors, and doing well. Completion of cases started. These are the figures of cases that were started in the 12 months to March 2011. Many of you will have seen this slide before, but it illustrates that the number of contracts are completing 75% or more of their cases in a 3-year time span. It was about half of orthodontic contracts. I think it should be more than that, but orthodontic contracts are tending to do better than the general contracts and the mixed mandatory general contracts. It is, of course, and I bang on about this every year, so sorry if you're getting bored with hearing it, it is a statutory requirement to tell the BSA within 2 months of the completion or termination of treatment that course of treatment is completed, and it's through the FP 17.0, of course. There's no units credited, of course, and you need to complete box 6 and send it in, and I'm sure that everyone in this audience does, but a surprising number don't. If we look back over the figures, I'll just race through these, but back in 2011-12, when I first presented this data, there were 193,000 or so case starts and about 141,000 reported completions in the same year. Now, they were not the same cases. The match completions were slightly fewer, and match completions are fewer. That's the same patient where you actually look back, is that patient who started 3 years ago completed, or more than 3 years, 3 years or more. The following year, 2012-13, there were more case starts. This is the year that the PCTs were abolished, so there was some funding available for more case starts. The reported completions were still only about 77.7%. Now, it should be 100%, because these are abandoned, discontinued, and completed cases. So you should be reporting the case one way or the other. Following year, slightly fewer cases with the first year of the area teams. Better response rate in terms of the reported completion, so the message perhaps is getting through. But then the disappointment of this year saying that it's dropped again. So a similar number of case starts, but only 80.5% completions. So there is an inertia in reporting completions still. Of course, there's no incentive to do so. There's no units to do so. The only incentive is if somebody comes knocking, because it is a statutory and contractual requirement to do so. And there's the slide which shows we've got a disappointing drop off. It really should be going up towards 100. I'm sure it would if we gave a unit of activity at the end, but at the moment that would require legislation to be changed. this is an interesting slide. This is from a different piece of work. This work is being done by my colleagues in Eastbourne to try to find ways of improving the efficiency of the orthodontic contract. They're working at the NHS BSA across the health service, not just dentistry, not just orthodontics, but across the NHS to find savings. So they're looking at pharmaceuticals and optics. And this was a cohort of patients. Any patient started in the calendar year 2010, their treatment has been assessed from the information that's held, and this is known outcomes. So bear in mind in here there'll be about 20%. We just don't know what's happened to them because we're not getting told. So obviously this pinky type colour is the open courses of treatment. So obviously in day one, they're all open. The blue is the completed, and the burgundy type colour is abandoned and discontinued. And as you'd expect, as the months go by, the number is quite a few abandoned, discontinued early in treatment. I mean, one has to question that. Is it removables being fitted and not being properly supported? Poor case selection, functionals. There's a big dropout with twin blocks when the patients aren't properly supported. So one does have to question that. But here we go. So we've got quite a few cases completed in 6 months, 9 months. Dual arch fixed in 6 to 9 months in the NHS for a needy patient. You're quicker than me. And that grows up gradually as it goes on. So 42 months down the line, this is the proportion of still in treatment, completed, abandoned, discontinued, and there'll be another 20% on top of that who we don't know what's happened to them. This is part of the same work, and I thought this was very interesting. It does take some explaining this side, so do please bear with me while I try and explain it. This is called a survival rate analysis, and it's the proportion of patients continuing orthodontic treatment for known outcomes. So these are the ones that we know. It doesn't include the 20% we don't know what's happened to them. Completed versus abandoned and discontinued. And the blue is the completed, the green is the combined, and the burgundy is the abandoned and discontinued. And what they've done, they basically have gone back through the data to see when the case was reported as completed, abandoned, or discontinued. And it shows that at 18 months, about 60% of cases are still in treatment. So the median value for the course of treatment, NHS-funded orthodontics in England and Wales, is about 21 months. So that is the median value, and the mean is somewhere between 18 and 21 months. So that's for the reported completions. For the abandoned and discontinued, it's the median is where it crosses the 50%. So it's there, so it's about 13 months, and the mean is about 12 to 14 months. So that's the figures. So I think interesting. I'll just remind you of the completion challenge that we conducted back in 2011. This is where we approached contracts that were poor reporters of completions and asked them what's happened to these cases, and they were all given a list, you may remember, and some we actually wanted chapter and verse what had happened to them. Others we just asked them, can you please send in your forms? This was what was said then. You may remember the incomplete cases after 36 months more. The feedback was, well, 18% still in treatment, and that's borne out by those survival rate analysis that you've just seen. Lengthy courses of treatment, but if there are impacted canines and functional followed by fixed, you can understand why. 40% had been completed and discharged, they just hadn't sent in the form. 13% were completed and still in their period of supervised retention. 19% were abandoned, of which 12 had not, because there's two different sorts of abandoned, obviously where the patient says, please take it off, I've had enough, and the 12% failed to return. 2% discontinued, 4% transferred, and 4% other. If we look at the reasons, administrative error is the commonest reason, and then there was this, hopefully these would hardly register now, but there will be some that don't keep abreast of what you're supposed to do. Unclear how to report, unsure when to report, unaware of the requirement to report. Some that had said they'd just recently done it, so it hadn't registered in the system. 10% other, and 25% they couldn't be bothered to give us a reason. If we now look finally at the 2014-15 activity, and again, I'm going to show some 13-14 figures, largely just because it illustrates quite nicely the changing patterns of behaviour in certain areas, almost certainly as a response to the commissioning guidance document. These are the assess and refuse cases. So this was 13-14 data, and as you can see, the vast majority of assess and refuses are IOTN3 ineligible. For me, that's absolutely appropriate. A GDP, when identifying a patient may or may not need orthodontics, is quite within his or her rights and should, I believe, send them for a specialist opinion. The twos, you can start to argue the toss with them. They number 30%, but nonetheless, I can understand why GDPs feel pressurized to get a second opinion. And then obviously these are the blue is the IOTN4s, and the burgundy is the missing IOTN, the purple the missing IOTN, and the burgundy is the IOTN5s. So that's 2013-14. The next slide was the last financial year, almost unchanged, remarkably similar figures. So there's virtually no change in the pattern of behaviour for the assess and refuses, but of course there'd be good reason for that, because there's not much you can do about that as recipients of referrals. It's at the other end, it's at the referring practitioner's end. So better training of GDP referrers may reduce the twos, may even reduce some of the threes, although I think that's disputable. But that's the only reason and way you could get that down, I would say. And bear in mind what I said, that the assess and refuse has increased from circa 10% to 13%, so we're still getting lots of patients sent who are not eligible, or indeed some cases suitable, for NHS-funded orthodontic treatment. That's a challenge to address that. My view is that it serves the population well. I firmly believe that GDPs should be able to refer any patient they think would benefit from a specialist opinion for a specialist opinion. Orthodontic treatment protocol, this is appended to everyone's contracts, or should be. It was agreed between the Department of Health and the British Orthodontic Society, and this excerpt is the relevant bit for this part of the discussion. Treatment will normally be completed with fixed appliances in both arches. Treatment of a single arch is appropriate, but should only be undertaken where this would be sufficient to achieve the requisite quality of outcome. And again, I'll show you 2013-14. So this is the burgundy is the ortho practices, and the blue is the mixed. And it won't surprise you that the mixed contracts tend to do fewer dual arch fixed. 60% of ortho are dual arch fixed, and that's dual arch fixed alone. If you factor in all of the others, 3/4 of cases are dual arch fixed with another appliance. And about, well, 57.9% to be precise of mixed contracts. But we still have this huge proportion of cases where they don't report the appliances. So until we get mandatory completion of FP70 forms, we can't really properly monitor what's being done out there, because these could be single arch treatments, they could be dual arch fixed, everything done as we would hope and expect. Figures for 2014-15, very similar, but there are favourable signs that practitioners, the message has come home, particularly to the mixed contract holders who are not, but as a general rule, specialists, that really if you're doing NHS-funded orthodontics, you should be doing your best to align and level both arches to try to get the occlusion as good as possible. Dual arch fixed don't have to be used in every case, but they should be in the majority. And the trend is favourable. If we look at the trend over the last few years, there's been an upward trend of dual arch fixed. That's the total, so that's dual arch fixed plus any other appliance that you may choose to use along the way. Dual arch fixed only, again, an upward trend. The green line is no reported appliances. That is dropping, but it's still far too many. The purple is dual arch fixed appliance other. And then these are the lower ones, and the single figure percentages are the removable only, the functional and removable only. And as we would expect, they are in the low figures, as they should be. If we finish off with the activity for the last couple of years, this touches on what Colin said about the proportion, how it sometimes it is seen out of proportion what element of orthodontic expenditure is spent on reviews or assess and refuse. And this illustrates it nicely. It also illustrates the proportion of orthodontic expenditure in England and Wales, that's for specialist practices, or orthodontic contracts, should we say. And 88%, pretty much 88% of the total UOAs in 2013-14 was orthodontic contracts. and about 12% if you lump those two together, which really they should be lumped together. It's a processing discrepancy which leads to them being separated. And as you would expect with the orthodontic contracts, there are pretty much the percentage reflects because it's the largest proportion, the assess and accept of the biggest proportion mirrors the total proportion because it's the biggest element. The assess and reviews slightly lower than that, so I think that's a drop in the assess and reviews because of the commissioning guidance. More assess and refuses than the others, but that's because referral-only practices are going to get them. Really, should you have assess and refuse claims in a mixed mandatory contract? That's a debatable one. And I'll just take you back, so if you just flick on this, so that you'll see the figures change very slightly. And this is 2014-15. So there's actually an increasing proportion, albeit small, in orthodontics-only contracts, and the assess and refuse still about 90%. If you look at that in the slides, it shows the green is the ortho, the purple is the burgundy is the mixed, and the blue is the general, and it just illustrates really the vast majority of orthodontic activity is through specialist contracts. The assess and reviews shared pretty evenly between general and ortho. And 2014-15, hardly any change there. This is by contract type. So these contracts are GDS, PDS, and TDS. Obviously, PDS are the time-limited ones. These are the contracts that are changing their patterns of behavior most. The GDS contracts obviously are open-ended, tend to be mixed mandatory contracts, and the TDS is the salaried services. So you can see the vast majority is in PDS contracts. Well over 80% is in PDS contracts. And that's the 2014 figures. It's pretty similar. If we look at, so these are the final couple of slides just to finish off. 2013-14, these were the number of assess and accept UOAs, assess and review UOAs, and assess and refuse. And as Colin made reference to, if you sum all of the assess and review and assess and refuse UOAs together, you're getting 6.2% of the total. 93.8% of orthodontic expenditure was on treatment, courses of treatment. If we look at the last financial year, it's gone up. It's 95% now. The assess and refuse has reduced, and the assess and reviews, just get that right. The assess and refuse has dropped as well as a proportion of the overall expenditure. So 4.9% of assessment claims are, or activity is going on assessment claims only, whether it be a review or a refuse. So, I'm not saying that there isn't room for more value for money there, but I think it needs to be put into perspective. If we actually look at the number of cases that were treated, this was the 2013-14 figures, and if all of the assess and review UOAs were eliminated and turned into treatments, you'd get another 10,000 cases, and you get another 2,900 if you converted all the assess and refuses. That's dropped. The number of assess and reviews and assess and refuse cases has dropped because of the changing patterns of behaviour in the last financial year. If we look at the final two slides now, this is the assess and accept FP17s that we received. There was a spike in 2012-13 with the abolition of the PCETs. This is area team land now. If we look at the assess and accept for under 10s, be careful of the scale. That's obviously hundreds of thousands. This is 10,000. It doesn't show very well there, so I'll show you in another slide to illustrate that. Again, the 10 to 17-year-olds, vast majority of treatments are 10 to 17-year-olds, and this is 1,500 or so 18 plus receiving NHS-funded orthodontic treatment in primary care. And this final slide is just to illustrate what Colin was telling me anecdotally, is that there is a reduction in the number of courses of treatment, a gradual reduction and a continuing decline in the number of under 10s being treated with appliances. Now, if that's because the appliances previously were unnecessary or inappropriate, no problem, it's better value for money. But if it's because people are changing their patterns of behaviour and declining to see under 10s because they are fearful of their ratios, then clearly that's something that needs to be addressed because it isn't in patients' interest. We all know that interceptive orthodontics has its place and patients will benefit from it, and we shouldn't be in a position where practitioners are having to decline to see patients, worst of all, at all, or subsequently provide treatment just because they're fearful of draconian actions if they become an outlier in their ratios. And so that's just some food for thought there, and that concludes what I've got to say.